Looking at this 1954 map of French Indochina, a strict dividing line across the 17th parallel splits Vietnam. In the north, Ho Chi Minh established a communist government. In the south, an opposing capitalist government took hold, funded by the United States. American leadership operated under a specific geopolitical anxiety known as the domino theory. They believed that one neighbor falling to communism would inevitably cause a chain reaction, bringing down the surrounding Asian countries in quick succession. To prevent this scenario, Washington heavily armed the South Vietnamese forces. But as those troops continually lost ground to northern guerrilla fighters, the United States decided to intervene directly, requiring a legal justification to deploy its military. In 1964, reports emerged of attacks on an American naval destroyer positioned at sea off the Vietnamese coast. This event, known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, allowed Congress to grant the president unchecked authority to launch a full-scale military offensive. The United States stepped onto the battlefield, claiming the role of a global protector of democracy. By relying on a heavily disputed naval incident to bypass standard declarations of war, the government set the stage for an escalating conflict with very few legal boundaries. By 1965, a massive fleet of helicopters and roughly 500,000 American troops arrived in Vietnam. They brought state-of-the-art rifles, tanks, and bomber planes, expecting their overwhelming technological advantage to produce a swift victory. But the landscape itself rejected conventional tactics. The local Viet Cong fighters utilized the dense tropical underbrush to launch sudden, localized attacks before vanishing back into the foliage. The fighters also dug hundreds of miles of intricate, claustrophobic dirt tunnels, like the famous Cu Chi network. This underground infrastructure allowed them to move entire battalions undetected, rendering American aerial superiority largely useless. Facing an invisible enemy and mounting casualties, the U.S. military shifted its strategy. If they could not locate the fighters within the forest, they decided to eradicate the forest entirely. The military began spraying millions of gallons of Agent Orange over the lush canopy. This highly toxic chemical defoliant was engineered to instantly kill trees and wipe out agricultural crops, intentionally starving rural populations to flush out the fighters. This was paired with the widespread deployment of napalm. This incendiary jelly-like substance stuck to human skin and burned down to the bone at temperatures that water could not extinguish, completely incinerating hundreds of rural villages. Unable to outmaneuver the local guerrilla forces, the world's wealthiest military chose to simply weaponize the ecosystem itself, accepting the destruction of innocent farming communities as an inherent cost of the campaign. Because the Viet Cong fought without traditional uniforms, American soldiers were trained to view every single civilian as a potential threat. This constant suspicion bred a deep, institutionalized paranoia among the troops. This environment enabled horrifying systemic violence, largely directed at rural Vietnamese women. During routine village sweeps, soldiers frequently subjected civilian women to planned sexual assaults, torture, and group executions. This culture of unchecked aggression culminated in events like the 1968 My Lai massacre. Here, American soldiers rounded up hundreds of completely unarmed villagers, many of them women and infants huddling in terror, and methodically gunned them down. For those who survived the sweeps, the destruction of the agricultural economy left them with nothing. To secure basic rations and shelter, thousands of displaced women were driven into prostitution around the perimeters of U.S. military bases. The sheer scale of this displacement and abuse created a heavy psychological trauma that permeated the daily existence of the surviving population. The United States entered Vietnam claiming to defend the freedom of the Vietnamese people. By systematically targeting the region's most vulnerable civilians, the military hierarchy eroded any remaining moral justification for its presence. As journalists documented the grim reality on the ground, the American public responded. Millions of citizens organized widespread, intense anti-war protests, marching directly on the Capitol to demand an end to the violence. Bowing to severe domestic outrage and a failing military campaign, the U.S. government eventually signed the Paris Peace Accords, fully withdrawing its combat troops by 1973. 2 years later, on April 30, 1975, Northern forces pushed deep into the south, moving toward the Capitol building in Saigon to capture the city and unify Vietnam under a single independent government. The American military apparatus left the country, but the millions of gallons of toxic defoliants they sprayed remained deeply embedded in the soil and water supply. 4 decades later, the biological impact of Agent Orange is still destroying lives. The severe DNA corruption caused by the chemical has led to generations of children born with extreme, debilitating physical deformities. The Vietnam War stands as a defining military failure. The devastation inflicted upon the land and the agonizing health crises still endured by the people reveal exactly what happens when a global power prioritizes its ideological image over the value of human life.